Chapter 14. Afterlives. When Francis Barber died in 1801, the annuity of £70 a year came to an end. Indeed, his lack of money suggests that he was no longer receiving the payments, perhaps having sold the right for a lump sum. His widow Elizabeth was left with little source of income, and with 2 daughters at home to support. Their son Samuel had left home. The Barbers had been anxious to give him a good education, and he had been sent to a boarding school in Lichfield. He left the school around 1799 and, as noted earlier, was employed for several years as a servant by Gregory Hickman, a surgeon in Burslem, some 35 miles from Lichfield. The Johnson connection had served Samuel Barber well. Hickman was a distant relation of Johnson, and his grandfather had known Johnson. The Barber's elder daughter, Elizabeth, did not survive her father long. She died in Burntwood in March 1802, at the age of 20. Barber's widow and their surviving daughter, Anne, moved back to Lichfield, where they once again lived on Stowe Street and kept a day school for children. Johnson's old friend Mrs. Thrale, now Mrs. Piozzi, who visited Lichfield in April 1809, was skeptical about Anne's paternity. "I saw a girl at Lichfield lately, who called herself, and was called by others, the daughter of Dr. Johnson's Negro Francis. She was rather a remarkably fair girl, and approaching to pretty." The school did not make much money, and Elizabeth Barber was reduced to selling mementos of Dr. Johnson, as Francis had done before her. The Reverend Thomas Whalley, the clergyman who visited Mrs. Barber in 1810, wrote in a letter to the European magazine that she had in her possession many articles formerly the property of the doctor, which her necessities and not her will have obliged her to part with. One of the last items she parted with was the miniature painting of Johnson which he had given to her many years earlier. Whalley's letter included an unfavorable account of Mrs. Piozzi's actions on her visit the previous year. As we have seen, even though Johnson by that time had been dead for 25 years, Piozzi still resented the fact that Francis Barber had inherited items which had been her gifts to Johnson. She wanted them back, and at last an opportunity arose. Travelling from London to her estate at Brynbella in Wales, she stopped over at the George Inn in Lichfield and summoned Elizabeth Barber. The call to attend on a wealthy lady may have aroused some hopes in the impoverished widow, but if so they were soon dashed as it became clear that Mrs. Piozzi's principal concern was with the gifts she had given to Johnson. Whalley recounted what occurred. "I also heard of a pocketbook purchased in France by a literary lady, one of his warm admirers, and presented to him, the doctor, by her. This lady, in passing through Lichfield, on her road into Wales, a short time since, sent, from the George Inn, to Mrs. Barber, expressing a wish to speak with and to serve her, but, at the interview, the pocketbook was principally inquired after, and it was reluctantly given back to the original donor, who hailed it, in a poetical rhapsody, as a long-lost friend restored, yet the remuneration given to the poor woman for it was scarcely its value as leather and prunella." Whalley's readers would have understood that the book's value as leather and prunella was its scrap value. This account was not entirely fair to Mrs. Piozzi. She may have been more interested in the pocketbook than in Elizabeth Barber, but she was aware of the family's poverty, recording that they were in San Juan, and gave her a guinea for the book. The money may not have been much to Mrs. Piozzi, but it was more than a week's wages for many people, almost certainly including Elizabeth Barber. Elizabeth Barber died in Lichfield in 1816, at the age of 60, and Anne went to live with her brother Samuel. He had left the service of Gregory Hickman some years earlier and entered the employment of the famous Burslem potter Enoch Wood, who had been an apprentice of Josiah Wedgwood. During the 19th century the pottery industry of Staffordshire expanded enormously, so that by 1900 there were 300 factories making china and earthenware in the towns which made up the area known as the Potteries, of which Burslem was one. The manufacturers included such famous names as Wedgwood, Spode, and Minton. Samuel Barber became a potter's printer, preparing the designs which would be transferred onto the pottery, and the first of several generations of barbers to work in that trade. The best source of information about Samuel Barber is an appreciation of his life which was published in the Primitive Methodist magazine in 1829, although some allowance has to be made for the fact that it clearly reflects the perspective of the magazine's readership. According to this account, as a young man Samuel Barber seems to have been something of a dandy, enjoying music and dancing and spending much time dressing his hair. He was, as he afterwards expressed it, as proud a fop as ever lived. In 1806, however, Barber's life changed dramatically under the influence of the flourishing Methodist movement. Methodism was a considerable force in Staffordshire, and its heart was in Burslem, the site of the first Methodist society in the county. John Wesley preached there and at other places nearby on many occasions. "At Burslem I was obliged to preach abroad," wrote Wesley in his journal in March 1790, "such were the multitudes of the people." At the age of 23 Samuel Barber experienced a profound Christian conversion, becoming very active among the Methodists and serving as a local preacher in 1809. Just a few years later, Burslem was the center of a group which broke away from the Wesleyan Methodists. A practice which developed locally, adopted from American revivalist movements, was the holding of camp meetings, open-air gatherings at which exuberant preaching, singing, and prayer would go on deep into the night. One such meeting took place in 1807 on Mocop, a hill near Stoke-on-Trent, lasting from 6 in the morning until 8 in the evening, and it attracted the disapproval of the more conservative Wesleyan authorities, who ordered that there should be no more camp meetings. Some local Methodists refused to comply, and the conflict resulted in the expulsion of two figures who had been a considerable influence on Barber, Hugh Bourne, and William Close. Bourne was expelled from the Methodist Society in 1808 and Close in 1810. The two men became the leading figures in a movement known as the Primitive Methodist Connection, and Barber joined them. The Primitive Methodists were much more emotional than the Wesleyan Methodists, their worship being marked by loud cries and exorcisms. In 1811 Samuel Barber's commitment to the Primitive Methodists was further deepened when he married Frances Sherwin, who was also active in the movement. The couple had 6 children, of whom 2 died young and 1 did not marry. As to the remaining offspring, Martha Barber married one John Snade, and the couple immigrated to the United States in 1848. 2 years later, Enoch Barber followed in their footsteps. It may well be that there are Barber descendants living in the United States today. The oldest child of Samuel and Frances Barber was Isaac, who was born in 1813. Samuel became a well-known preacher and leader within the Primitive Methodists, despite working 14 to 16-hour days at the potteries. He journeyed hundreds of miles, sometimes traveling up to 20 miles on a Sunday to preach and then returning the same day. He was not thought of as a great preacher. It was said of him that as a preacher, his talents were not of the first order. Nonetheless he was highly regarded, perhaps because he was an advocate for short meetings, and usually spoke to the people in a brief, concise way. Samuel Barber died on July 6, 1828. By that time the Primitive Methodists numbered over 31,000, and Samuel was the 11th preacher of 55 in terms of seniority on the Tunstall preaching circuit. But his status as a preacher was not of interest to the newspapers which reported his death, and they did not mention it. What made him newsworthy was that he was son of the late Mr. Francis Barber, the faithful, black, servant, and residuary legatee of the great Dr. Samuel Johnson. Like his father, Isaac Barber worked in the potteries, becoming a mold maker in Burslem at Pinder, Bourne and Hope's, earthenware manufacturers who were later to become Dalton's, the china makers. One of Isaac's colleagues there was John Lockwood Kipling, father of Rudyard, who was articled as a designer and modeler from about 1851 to 1858. In 1865 he emigrated to India to take up a post as professor of architectural sculpture, and he spent most of the rest of his life there. Writing in 1908, Kipling recalled that Isaac Barber had a certain hoarse quality in his voice, which I have since heard in many lands. Woolly hair and mulatto features. He also remarked that Barber was not a particularly good workman, nor was he popular with his fellows, being a dull and not very intelligent man. Not in the least an interesting person. I do not recall a single suggestive fact or recollection being drawn from him, and yet I frequently talked with him. It is impossible to say whether Isaac Barber was actually so completely devoid of interest, or whether this simply reflects the memories of a man in his 70s recalling an acquaintance after a gap of 50 years. It may be too that Kipling's views were tainted by a degree of skepticism about whether Isaac was who he claimed to be. Kipling described him as a man of color, claiming to be a descendant of Frank Barber, Dr. Johnson's servant. Isaac Barber married Martha Bryan in 1848, and they had 4 children, one of whom is believed to have died young. The others were Enoch, born 1849, Edward, born 1854, and Sarah, born 1857. All 3 of these great-grandchildren of Francis Barber worked in the pottery industries, Enoch as a mold maker, Edward as a hollowware presser, responsible for pressing clay into molds for the manufacture of jugs and pots, and Sarah as a gilder of pottery. They all married and had between them 11 children, the great-great-grandchildren of Francis Barber. The total number of the subsequent descendants of Francis Barber is not known, but it is possible to follow the history of at least one line right down to the present day. Isaac's son Enoch married Louisa Parker in 1878. They had 4 children, Francis, William Edward, Ted, Frederick, and Hilda. Ted was a mold maker, like his father and grandfather before him, though he also served in the army for a time, and he was baptized and brought up in the Primitive Methodists. He married Sarah Rowley, and they had 8 children, 7 of whom married and had, between them, 20 children. Ted and Sarah's third son, Norman Barber, was born in 1920 and died in 1986. He was the first for several generations not to go into the pottery industries, working as a jeweler throughout his life, with the exception of the years 1939–45, when he served in the Royal Artillery, reaching the rank of Battery Sergeant Major. He married Audrey Keithley in 1946, and the couple settled in Burslem and had 3 children, Cedric, Stephen, and Sandra. Cedric Barber served as a police officer and later worked in insurance sales. He married Leslie Brace, and they had 2 children, Christopher, born in 1974, and Caroline, born in 1978. Christopher and Caroline are in the 7th generation to be descended directly from Francis Barber. This is only one line of descent. In all probability there are hundreds of other members of that generation. The question is sometimes asked, if thousands of black people lived in Britain in the 18th century, what became of them? Francis Barber and his descendants provide at least part of the answer. Like so many others in Staffordshire, they worked in the pottery factories and worshipped with the Methodists. In wartime they served in the armed forces. They married and had children and grandchildren. In short, they formed part of the everyday life of the country. To this day Francis Barber's descendants continue to live in Staffordshire. How do these modern-day Barbers regard their ancestor Francis? There are signs that attitudes have changed over the years. Dennis Barber, a 6th-generation descendant born in 1930, was fascinated by the story which was passed down to him and wanted to find out more, an attitude that was shared by his contemporaries. Most people think it's wonderful, he recalled. People that I worked with thought it was a fascinating story. But when he was a child the matter was regarded as not quite respectable. It was not a subject spoken about outside the family. My mother didn't like to hear any talk about Francis Barber. My father always raised it and called him Mr. Barber. My mother always used to turn around and say, "Look, don't talk about that black man in front of the children." I think it's because she was the older generation. For Dennis's cousin Cedric Barber, born in 1948 and also a 6th-generation descendant, the discovery that he was descended from a black slave was a positive experience. My black roots have risen to the forefront of my consciousness in recent years, and I have to say that this awareness of my family has revolutionized my life, he wrote. Finding my family was African, and all that that meant, slavery, ill treatment, was also very emotional. Several years have passed since I attended the lecture in Dr. Johnson's house, and I am back there once again, viewing the same picture of the young black man. On the previous occasion there were many other visitors, but this time the building is closed to the public because a small team is making a BBC television documentary entitled The Black 18th Century. The program takes as its starting point several portraits of black men and women of the period. Ignatius Sancho is one of those featured. He was born on a slave ship around 1729, and became a domestic servant and later a grocer in Westminster. His published letters have made him perhaps the best-known Black Briton of his time. His portrait by Gainsborough now hangs in the National Gallery of Canada. Dido Elizabeth Bell also features in the program. As discussed earlier, she was the mixed-race great-niece of Lord Mansfield and was brought up in his household alongside Lady Elizabeth Murray, another great-niece. The 2 girls were painted together in their teens, looking affectionate and happy in each other's company. Another picture which appears in the Black 18th Century is the portrait of the black man which hangs in Dr. Johnson's house. Cedric Barber is filmed in front of it, expressing his pride in his ancestor. We know the history of Francis Barber, but what about the history of this painting? And is the face in the picture really that of Francis Barber? The archives of Dr. Johnson's house show that the portrait which hangs there was at one time the property of Sir James Knight Bruce, 1791–1866, a judge of the High Court, and it was passed down through the family to his great-grandson David Menlore. In 1933 Menlore agreed to exhibiting the picture for a few months in Dr. Johnson's house. The house had recently been bought by Cecil Harmsworth, a Liberal Member of Parliament. It had gone through many uses since Johnson's day and had recently been a cheap boarding house. When Harmsworth bought it, the building was in a state of considerable disrepair and seemed to be fit for nothing but demolition, but he was determined to save it for the public. He restored it and handed it over to a charitable trust in 1929. When the picture was displayed in the house in 1933, Harmsworth took a great interest in it, and in the connection to Johnson. The following year Minlor indicated that he planned to sell the portrait in the United States, but Harmsworth was determined that it should stay in the house. In July 1934 he bought it from Minlor for £40 and gave it to the house. The correspondence surrounding the acquisition of the portrait shows that Harmsworth was anxious to establish the identities of both the sitter and the artist. He wrote to Arundel Esdale, Secretary of the British Museum, "The question is it Francis Barber, and is it by Sir Joshua?" Esdale consulted Edward Croft Murray, then assistant keeper in the Department of Prints and Drawings and later to become a well-known art historian. Croft Murray concluded that the portrait was not an original by Joshua Reynolds, but a copy. He added, "It is however a portrait of Francis Barber," but he gave no reasons for this confident identification. The history of the picture is much better known today, and it is now established that the painting which hangs in Dr. Johnson's house is a copy of a portrait by Joshua Reynolds. The date of the original is uncertain. Nicholas Penny, who curated the Joshua Reynolds exhibition at the Royal Academy of Arts in 1986, wrote that it is exceedingly hard to date this study on stylistic grounds, but seems likely. Similarly, David Mannings and Martin Possil, in their magisterial Sir Joshua Reynolds, a complete catalogue of his paintings, 2000, describe it as painted C. The history of the original portrait can be traced forward to the present day. Following Reynolds's death, the picture was sold at auction by Greenwoods in 1796. The purchaser was Sir George Beaumont, a close friend of Reynolds's. It remained in the Beaumont family until 1902, when it was sold to the well-known art gallery Carnegie. Over the next 80 years it passed through various hands until 1983, when it was sold by the Comtesse Alexander de Castro to the Menil Foundation Collection in Texas, where it remains. The identity of the artist who painted the copy which hangs in Dr. Johnson's house is unknown. David Minlor told Cecil Harmsworth that he was certain that it was by James Northcote, who certainly painted copies of numerous works by Reynolds, and his assessment is probably the origin of the statement attributed to James Northcote, which now appears on the picture frame. Modern expert opinion, however, rejects that attribution. It is likely that a number of artists had access to the original painting, as it is well known that Reynolds encouraged his pupils to copy his work. There was also opportunity for copies to be made at a later date, as pictures which were exhibited at the British Institute for Promoting the Fine Arts, as the Reynolds original was in 1813 and 1823, were commonly left there for some weeks, in order to allow young painters to copy them. This explains the fact that at least 5 other copies of this particular portrait exist. The British Museum and the Victoria and Albert Museum both have copies, Tate Britain has 2, and there is a miniature copy in the Hyde collection at Harvard. It seems likely that the painter of the picture which hangs in Johnson's house will remain unidentified, but what of the identity of the sitter? When the portrait was put up for sale in Paris by the Comtesse de Castro in 1983, it was described in the sale catalogue as Portrait de Frank Barber, Serviteur du Docteur Samuel Johnson. The Menil Foundation catalogue describes it more circumspectly as a young black. Many writers have reproduced this picture, stating that the face is that of Francis Barber. John Wayne, Walter Jackson Bate, and Geoffrey Myers all do so in their biographies of Samuel Johnson, and Falarin Shailen and Gretchen Gerzina do likewise in their studies of British black history. Any internet search for references to Francis Barber is likely to bring up this picture. Not everyone, however, has been convinced that the portrait is of Francis Barber. A note of caution was sounded 100 years ago by Ale and Lyle Reed, who wrote that the identification was yet to be proved. The identification of the sitter as Francis Barber rests on 2 pieces of evidence. The first is an entry which appears in Joshua Reynolds's pocket book for April 23, 1767. It did not become public knowledge until 1865, when Charles Leslie and Tom Taylor published their Life and Times of Sir Joshua Reynolds, which reproduced many extracts from Reynolds's pocket books. In their printed list of sitters for April 1767 appears the name Frank. Leslie and Taylor added after this entry a cautious suggestion: Barber, Johnson's black servant. But in 1899, when Algernon Graves and William Von Cronin published their work, A History of the Works of Sir Joshua Reynolds, the tentative nature of the identification had vanished and they categorically described the portrait as being of Francis Barber, Dr. Johnson's black servant. In fact, the evidence of the pocket book is far from clear, for several reasons. The first is that Leslie and Taylor misread the entry, which reads not Frank but Franks, as Nicholas Penny pointed out in 1986. Penny suggested that it is a reference to the members of the Franks family, whom Reynolds was painting around that time, but it seems unlikely that any member of the Franks family would have been referred to simply as Franks. Throughout, the pocketbook entries meticulously use the correct title of the sitter: Mr., Mrs., Miss, Master, Captain, Sir, and so on. There were 16 sittings for the Franks family paintings, and on each occasion the entry is for Mr. Franks, Mrs. Franks, or Miss Franks. In any event, the paintings of members of the Franks family were completed and paid for in 1766, well before April 23, 1767. A reference to Frank seems more likely than the rather discourteous Franks. It is possible that the entry is simply a slip of the pen and that Frank was intended. If this is the case, then it refers to someone in Reynolds's acquaintance who was referred to simply as Frank, and Francis Barber remains a possible candidate. If it is a reference to Barber, it probably does indicate a sitting for a portrait. The pocketbooks include social and business engagements as well as sittings, but it is unlikely that Reynolds would have had such an appointment with the servant of his old friend. The second clue regarding the identity of the subject comes from the description of the picture as it appeared in various exhibition catalogues. As noted above, the portrait was first owned by Sir George Beaumont, the 7th Baronet, who bought it in 1796, at the Greenwood's auction. It was described in the sale catalogue as "study of a black man's head." Beaumont was a wealthy collector and patron whose gift of paintings to the nation was to form the basis of the National Gallery. He was also a talented amateur artist and a friend of Reynolds, who had painted his portrait. When the British Institution for Promoting the Fine Arts was founded in 1805, he was closely involved, serving as one of the committee of subscribers and one of the first directors, and in 1813 he helped to arrange a retrospective exhibition of Reynolds's work at the institution. Beaumont lent the portrait for display in that exhibition, and it appears in the exhibition catalogue as "Portrait of a Black Servant of Sir Joshua Reynolds." In this light it is very difficult to see how the portrait can be of Francis Barber. Beaumont had known Reynolds well and was in a position to say whether the picture was of his servant. As an organizer of the exhibition, it is unlikely that he would have permitted the catalogue entry to appear if he did not believe it to be correct. Additional evidence supports this identification. As noted earlier, James Northcote wrote that Reynolds portrayed his black footman in several pictures. It seems most likely that the picture is indeed of Reynolds's servant. So what is the origin of the claim that the figure in the portrait is Francis Barber? Its source can be traced to the catalogue of another exhibition, the Catalogue of the Art Treasures of the United Kingdom, collected at Manchester in 1857. Here the painting was described as a Negro. Frank Barber, Dr. Johnson's black servant. Even that identification, qualified as it was by a question mark, was given with some reservations. George Scharf, the curator of the exhibition, noted that the pictures are all described under the names given by the present owners. The owner at that time was another Sir George Beaumont, the 9th Baronet, born in 1828, nephew of the original owner, who had died in 1827. In other words, the identification of the portrait as being of Francis Barber was first made over 50 years after Barber's death by an owner of the picture who had been born over 25 years after that death. There is no reason to believe that his claim was true. How much does it matter that the face in the picture is probably not that of Francis Barber? Of course, an authenticated portrait would be of enormous interest, but the Reynolds picture and the story of Francis Barber are both significant in their own right, irrespective of any link between them. Of one thing we can be certain: the portrait is of a young black man who lived in London in the mid-18th century. In spite of the best efforts of historians, the details of many such lives are likely to remain unknown. The Reynolds portrait, together with its numerous copies, provide a permanent reminder that a black community did exist and formed part of the social fabric of 18th century Britain. It is particularly appropriate that a copy should hang in Dr. Johnson's house, which was home to one such young black man, the former slave Francis Barber. There are no memorials to Barber, although perhaps the occasional passerby in Streatham wonders at the name of Francis Barber Close. His legacy lies in his numerous descendants, but also in the story of one man's journey from Jamaican slavery to freedom in England. At its heart is the bond between Barber and Samuel Johnson. It was in many ways a father-son relationship, with all that encompasses in terms of intimacy, possessiveness, exasperation, and love. Johnson had an authoritarian side to his character, yet for the most part he treated Barber with respect and affection, providing him with a home, an education, and the means to live once he was gone. Barber regarded Johnson with honor, giving him support and companionship in the darkest of his often very dark days. Much of what each contributed to the other's life is unknowable to us, but in their actions we have the clearest possible indication of how each regarded the other. Samuel Johnson named Francis Barber his heir. Francis Barber named both his sons Samuel,